I didn't hear him approach from behind until it was too late. 1 minute, I was standing in my own kitchen, gripping my wife's phone, reeling from the text I'd just read. The next, I was slammed against the counter, two beefy hands pinning my arms behind me. My mind spun as I struggled to process what was happening, but then I saw him. Brad, standing in my kitchen like he owned the place. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me with a smug grin that sent a chill down my spine. "Guess the secret's out, huh?" he said, eyes gleaming with that same confidence I'd only read about in Caitlin's messages. And just then, as if the universe was mocking me, she walked in. My wife, Caitlin, the woman I'd given my life to, entered the room without so much as a hint of shame. She looked at me, a wicked smile playing on her lips, as she slid her arm around Brad's waist. "Let him go," Brad said to his thugs, nodding in my direction as if I was some pathetic inconvenience in his way. The moment my arms were free, I lunged at him, all common sense drowned out by a primal urge to do something, anything. But his thugs were faster, slamming me back down, one hand pressing against my neck, pinning me in place. Brad leaned down, his mouth close to my ear, voice dripping with mockery. "Listen, cuckold," he whispered, and I could feel his smirk without even looking at him. "If your life means anything to you, you'd better accept the situation and stay out of my way. Your wife is mine now, and I like it that way." It was like my whole world had shattered in a single moment, every truth I'd believed in reduced to a twisted joke. I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing, piecing together the insanity unfolding before me. Caitlin just watched, her eyes cold and unrecognizable, as if I were some stranger who'd wandered into her life by mistake. For a second, I thought maybe this was some horrific nightmare, that any moment I'd wake up, drenched in sweat but relieved. But then Brad chuckled, low and taunting, and I knew this was all too real. "Why?" I forced the word out, my voice hoarse, barely audible. Caitlin tilted her head, as if she were genuinely curious. "Why?" she echoed, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Isn't it obvious? I'm tired of being married to a boring, predictable man. With Brad, there's excitement, there's a spark. You don't understand because you stopped trying a long time ago." Each word was a slap to my face, each insult laced with venom. I'd always thought we were just like any other couple. Sure, we had our challenges, our ruts, but who didn't? I'd never imagined that Caitlin would go so far as to throw our life away for this. Brad crossed his arms, his eyes dancing between Caitlin and me, enjoying every second of my torment. "See, I don't think he understands, babe," he drawled, throwing her a look. "Maybe he needs a little help coming to terms." That's when I realized the situation was worse than I'd thought. Brad wasn't just here to taunt me. He wanted to make a point, to ensure that I understood my place in this twisted new reality they were creating. Caitlin didn't even flinch as Brad's goons stepped forward, their intentions clear. She simply leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching like she was a spectator at a show. The first punch hit my gut, the pain sharp and immediate, but the real pain was looking into her eyes and seeing nothing, no regret, no pity. Just cold satisfaction. "Stop," I gasped, more to her than to them, hoping for some shred of the woman I used to know. But Caitlin only shrugged, as if my pain was an inconvenience. "You brought this on yourself," she said, her tone icy. "Maybe if you'd paid more attention, you wouldn't be in this situation." The blows continued, each one blurring my vision, each one pounding into me not only physically but emotionally, cracking whatever hope I'd clung to. By the time they were done, I could barely stand, my head spinning, my body aching. But through the haze, one thought kept burning in my mind: this wasn't over. Brad sauntered back over to me, bending down, his grin wide. "Look at you. Pathetic," he sneered. "Get it into that thick skull of yours, Caitlin's mine now. I'm the one in charge, and you're nothing." I locked eyes with him, summoning whatever strength I had left, and forced a twisted smile. "We'll see about that," I muttered, barely able to get the words out. "You think you can take everything from me? I'm not going down that easily." Brad's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. He glanced at Caitlin, who shrugged, disinterested, clearly done with the drama. I could see that he wanted to shut me up permanently, but he was holding back, maybe trying to savor his victory. "Fine," he said, straightening up. "Keep clinging to your little fantasies. But remember, you've been warned." With that, he nodded to his thugs, and they grabbed me, dragging me out of my own house like I was nothing but trash to be thrown away. I looked back one last time, hoping, desperately, to see a flicker of something in Caitlin's eyes. But she just turned her back, walking into the arms of the man who had destroyed our life, our family, everything we'd built together. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed on the ground outside, coughing and gasping for breath. The night was cold and silent, the air biting at my bruised skin, but the chill that sank into my bones wasn't from the air, it was from the realization that I'd been completely, utterly betrayed. And that's when it hit me, the rage simmering beneath the hurt, the desire to reclaim my life, my dignity. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Brad thought he could waltz in, steal my wife, and humiliate me in my own home, he was dead wrong. I staggered to my feet, every part of my body screaming in protest, and I made a vow to myself right then and there. I wasn't going to let them win. Brad had started this game, but I was going to make damn sure I finished it. The pain settled into a dull ache as I staggered down the sidewalk, replaying every twisted detail in my head. Brad's smug face, Caitlin's cold indifference, it all fueled the fire burning in my gut. I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew I couldn't let them get away with it. This wasn't just about the betrayal anymore, it was about reclaiming my life, my pride. When I reached my car, I slumped into the driver's seat, breathing heavily, trying to pull myself together. But as I gripped the wheel, a plan started forming in my mind, piecing itself together in bits and fragments. Brad wanted me out of the picture? Fine. I'd stay out of sight for now, let them think they'd won. I would play their game, but I'd play it my way. And I wouldn't stop until I'd turned their little fantasy world into a nightmare. The first step was simple enough, get evidence. If I wanted to bring Brad and Caitlin down, I needed proof, something that would expose them for the liars and manipulators they were. It was time to gather every shred of information, to see just how deep this betrayal went. Over the next few days, I became a ghost in my own life, watching them from the shadows, tracking every move they made. It wasn't hard, Caitlin and Brad were careless, confident, acting as if I was out of their way for good. She even started flaunting him in places we used to go together, as if taunting me with her newfound freedom. Little did they know I was always nearby, watching, recording, collecting every moment of their twisted romance. One night, as I was tailing them, they pulled into a hotel parking lot on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you'd go if you wanted to be discreet but didn't care about appearances. I parked a safe distance away, waiting, watching. They didn't even bother to check if they were being followed. Brad's car door swung open, and he stepped out with his typical cocky swagger, holding out his hand to Caitlin. She looked up at him, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years. The sight stung, but it only fueled my determination. They disappeared into the hotel, and I slipped out of my car, grabbing the camera I'd borrowed from a friend. The plan was risky, but if I could get proof of them together, if I could expose them for what they were, it would be worth it. I managed to find a side entrance and slipped inside, keeping to the shadows, listening for their voices, watching for a glimpse of them in the hallway. After what felt like hours, I heard them, the door to their room slightly ajar. I took a deep breath, steadied the camera, and took the photos that would eventually be my proof. But just as I turned to leave, a voice came from behind me. Well. What do we have here? I froze, slowly turning around to find one of Brad's thug friends, arms crossed, grinning like he'd just caught the prize of a lifetime. Before I could react, he grabbed me by the collar and yanked me into the hallway, his grip like a vice. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong, dragging me down the hallway like I was nothing. He shoved me into an empty room and slammed the door shut behind us. I barely had time to catch my breath before Brad himself strode in, Caitlin trailing behind him with a smug look on her face. She crossed her arms, leaning against the wall as Brad approached me, his face twisted in a smile that made my stomach turn. "Didn't I warn you to stay out of my way?" he sneered, glancing at the camera still clutched in my hand. "Seems like you've got a bit of a problem following instructions." I tried to speak, to defend myself, but he cut me off, motioning for his thug to take the camera. "You think you're smart, huh? Following us around, taking pictures? You really thought this would end any way other than badly for you?" Caitlin laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the small room. "Pathetic," she said, looking at me with pure disdain. "I told you to let it go, didn't I? But you just had to play the hero." I felt my fists clench, my teeth grinding as I glared at them, refusing to back down. "You think you can just throw me away like trash? I gave you everything, Caitlin, and you tossed it aside for this?" She rolled her eyes, bored, and shrugged. "Face it, Alex. You're just not worth it. Brad's more of a man than you ever were." That was it. Any lingering love, any hope of reconciliation, shattered in that moment. The woman I'd married was gone, replaced by this stranger who looked at me like I was nothing. But if they thought I'd walk away quietly, they were wrong. Brad stepped forward, his face inches from mine, his voice a low growl. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I own Caitlin now. And if you know what's good for you, you'll take your broken little heart and disappear. Because next time, I won't be as nice." I stared back at him, fury boiling inside me, barely keeping myself from lunging at him then and there. But I knew that to win, I had to be smart. This was just the beginning, and I had to bide my time. With one last glance at Caitlin, who didn't even meet my eyes, I let them push me out the door, the humiliation burning deep. But as I walked away, battered and humiliated, I was more determined than ever. They had taken everything from me, left me with nothing to lose. And now, I was going to make sure they regretted every last minute of it. The days that followed were a blur of planning, plotting, and steeling myself for what I was about to do. If Brad and Caitlin thought they'd broken me, they had no idea what I was capable of. I wasn't going to charge in recklessly, no, I was going to dismantle everything they thought they'd secured, piece by piece. My mind worked like a machine, every gear grinding toward one goal, reclaiming my life by tearing down theirs. The first step was to hit Brad where it hurt. He was cocky, confident, and clearly careless, strutting around like he owned the world, thinking no one would dare stand up to him. I did some digging and found out more than I expected about his business dealings. Turns out, Mr. Perfect had his hands dirty in more than just my marriage. Shady contracts, unpaid debts, illegal transactions, the man was sitting on a powder keg, and I was about to light the fuse. I spent my nights piecing together everything I could find on Brad's finances, quietly contacting a lawyer who specialized in corporate fraud. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to get his interest piqued. The man's face lit up when I handed him the files, and I could see that he understood the game just as well as I did. "You've been busy," the lawyer, Mr. Harmon, said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This could ruin him." "That's the idea," I replied, feeling the first glimmer of satisfaction I'd felt in weeks. Mr. Harmon nodded, his eyes gleaming. "I'll handle it from here. You focus on whatever else you need to do." His words were laced with a subtle challenge, like he could tell there was more to this than just business. Leaving his office, I felt a surge of energy, the weight of helplessness starting to lift. Brad's empire was built on lies, and I'd just put a crack in the foundation. Now, It was time to go after Caitlin. She wasn't innocent in this, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. That's when I reached out to an old friend, Tyler. We hadn't spoken much since college, but I knew he was still in the private investigation business. I called him up, and after an awkward few minutes of small talk, I got to the point. "Tyler, I need your help with something personal," I began, careful with my words. "I'm dealing with a situation, and I need someone who knows how to dig deep without leaving a trace." He paused, then chuckled. "You never were one for subtlety, Alex. What exactly are you looking for?" "Proof," I said, gripping the phone tightly. "I need everything you can find on my wife and this guy she's been with. The more incriminating, the better." Tyler's tone shifted, his voice steady and professional. "Consider it done. Give me a few days." The waiting was the hardest part, but I kept myself busy, running over every possible angle, every potential weak point I could exploit. It wasn't long before Tyler came back with what he'd found, and what he handed me was a goldmine. Photos, text messages, hotel receipts, they'd been more careless than I'd imagined, leaving a trail of evidence so blatant it was almost insulting. I'd thought I'd steeled myself for what I'd see, but as I flipped through the images and messages, a fresh wave of anger surged through me. Brad and Caitlin weren't just having an affair, they were flaunting it. They'd used my credit card to book their little getaways, worn clothes I'd bought her, even dined at the restaurant where we'd had our anniversary dinner just a few months back. It was sickening, but now I had everything I needed to confront her and bring her down. I planned the confrontation carefully, knowing Caitlin would be furious that I'd uncovered everything. I waited until she was alone, knowing Brad wouldn't be around to back her up. She came home late that night, her heels clicking against the floor, the scent of some expensive perfume lingering in the air as she tossed her bag onto the couch. She didn't even notice me standing there in the shadows until I spoke. "Enjoy your night?" I asked, my voice echoing through the room, cold and steady. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked at me, a flicker of guilt flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with a scowl. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, clearly caught off guard. I stepped forward, holding up the stack of photos and messages Tyler had given me. "I think you know exactly what I'm doing here." Her face went pale for a moment, but then, just as quickly, she sneered, rolling her eyes. "So you're stalking me now? How pathetic can you get, Alex?" I clenched my fists, refusing to rise to her bait. "I'm done being your fool, Caitlin. I know everything. Every disgusting detail." She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "And what are you going to do about it? Go crying to your lawyer? Make a scene?" She laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. "Face it, Alex. You lost. Brad's more of a man than you ever were, and there's nothing you can do about it." I felt a surge of anger so intense I had to fight to keep control, my jaw clenching as I forced myself to speak calmly. "We'll see about that. Because you see, Caitlin, I'm not as weak as you think." She laughed again, but this time, there was an edge of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're all talk, Alex. You'll never do anything. That's why you're in this situation in the first place." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Watch me." With that, I turned and left, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, her smug expression faltering. This wasn't over, no, this was just the beginning. I was ready for whatever came next, and I knew exactly how to hit back. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Every fiber in me was focused, like a soldier preparing for battle. Caitlin and Brad wanted to play games, but now I was rewriting the rules, and this time, they would be the ones scrambling. First, I put the wheels in motion with the lawyer. Mr. Harmon had already started building his case, and he was more than happy to get things moving faster. With the evidence Tyler had collected, I had a strong case for divorce on grounds of infidelity, which meant I could protect most of my assets from being split. But I wanted more than that. I wanted to take back my life from these people who'd twisted it into something unrecognizable. Next, I went to my bank and cut off Caitlin's access to the joint account. I didn't want her spending another cent of my money on her cheap thrills. I could only imagine the shock on her face when she'd try to swipe her card next and realize the gravy train had come to a grinding halt. It was a small victory, but it was a start, and I wasn't going to stop until I'd taken everything back. Then came the masterstroke. I sent Brad's dirty financial dealings anonymously to his business partners. I wanted them to see the kind of man they were in bed with, and I knew that if I pushed the right buttons, his entire operation could crumble. By the time I was done, Brad would be too busy trying to keep his business afloat to worry about flaunting his relationship with my wife. It was like setting up a domino effect. All I needed to do was wait for the first one to fall. The night after I made those moves, I went back to our house, no, my house. Caitlin was sitting on the couch, scrolling on her phone, completely unaware of the storm I'd set in motion. She looked up as I walked in, her face twisting into a smirk. "What are you doing here?" she sneered. "I thought you'd finally crawled away for good." I ignored her taunt, tossing a thick manila envelope onto the coffee table. She glanced at it, her smirk faltering slightly. "What's this?" "Divorce papers," I said, my tone as steady as I could make it. "You wanted to be with Brad? Fine. Now you're free to go. But don't think for a second you're getting anything out of me." Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the realization dawning on her that this wasn't just a simple breakup. She was about to lose everything. "You can't be serious," she finally spat, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You really think you're going to walk away from this like you're the victim?" I leaned in, lowering my voice, locking eyes with her. "I am the victim, Caitlin. You and Brad stole my life, humiliated me, took everything I thought was real and turned it into a sick joke. But it's over now. I'm done playing by your rules." She clenched her jaw, crossing her arms defensively. "Brad's going to hear about this. He'll make sure you pay." I laughed, a dark, hollow sound that even surprised me. "Let him. In fact, tell him I look forward to it." The look in her eyes changed then. She was used to me being passive, to me quietly accepting whatever scraps of affection she threw my way. But the man standing in front of her wasn't the same man she'd grown accustomed to pushing around. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the door burst open, and in walked Brad, looking every bit as smug and self-satisfied as ever. He sauntered in, his eyes landing on the divorce papers, then on me, and a grin spread across his face. "Oh, this is rich," he said, laughing. The little man finally grew a spine. "What's next? You going to challenge me to a duel?" I held his gaze, unflinching, meeting his mockery head-on. "If that's what it takes, then yeah. But first, you might want to check your bank account and your inbox. You've got bigger problems than me now." His grin faltered for a split second, and I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He pulled out his phone, his fingers tapping quickly as he checked his messages. As he scrolled, his expression twisted, his mouth tightening, the color draining from his face. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave, suddenly deadly serious. I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Just gave a little nudge to the people you've been scamming. Thought they deserved to know who they're really dealing with." He glared at me, fists clenching at his sides, his eyes darkening with rage. For the first time, I saw a hint of fear behind that cocky facade, a realization that he wasn't invincible. He glanced at Caitlin, and I could see her confusion as she looked between us, trying to piece together what was happening. "You think you can ruin me?" Brad snarled, taking a step closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You think you can take me down?" I leaned forward, my voice low and deadly calm. I don't think, I know. Brad lunged, shoving me back, his face twisted in fury. I stumbled but held my ground, squaring up to him, refusing to back down. Caitlin screamed for us to stop, but I ignored her. This was between him and me. For a moment, I thought he might actually swing at me, but then he seemed to catch himself, taking a step back, breathing heavily. He looked at me with pure hatred, but beneath that, I saw the fear, the realization that his empire was crumbling around him, that I'd outmaneuvered him in ways he hadn't expected. Fine, he spat, grabbing Caitlin's arm and pulling her toward the door. You're not worth it, Alex. Enjoy your little victory. It won't last. I watched as he dragged her out, slamming the door behind them. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating, but for the first time in weeks, I felt alive. Like I'd finally taken back control. Brad and Caitlin were out of my life, and soon enough, Brad would be facing the consequences of his own arrogance. This wasn't the end, not yet. But it was a start. And now, with nothing left to lose, I was finally free to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the days that followed, I could almost feel the walls closing in on Brad. Word traveled fast among his business contacts, and soon enough, whispers of fraud and betrayal started to circulate. Every day, I heard new rumors, about deals falling apart, partners pulling out, clients refusing to pay. It was satisfying, watching his empire crumble from a safe distance, knowing I'd been the one to pull the first brick. But it didn't take long for Brad to come back, desperate and furious. One evening, I got a call from Tyler, my investigator friend. He sounded urgent, his voice laced with an edge I hadn't heard before. Alex, I just got word that Brad's on his way to see you. He's furious, man. I don't know what he's planning, but be prepared. My heart raced. I knew Brad would be angry, but something in Tyler's tone made me realize this wasn't going to be just another confrontation. Brad had nothing left to lose now, and that made him dangerous. Sure enough, an hour later, there was a loud bang on my front door, followed by Brad's voice booming from outside. Alex! Open up, you coward, he shouted, slamming his fist against the door. I could hear his voice slurring, a hint of alcohol mixed with rage. He sounded unhinged, like a man pushed to his breaking point. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before unlocking the door. There he was, disheveled, eyes wild, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He stumbled forward as the door swung open, glaring at me with pure hatred. You think you're so clever, don't you? He snarled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. You think you can just ruin my life and walk away? I held his gaze, refusing to let him see any fear. I didn't ruin anything, Brad. You did that all on your own. His face twisted, and for a moment, I thought he might actually throw a punch. But instead, he laughed, a bitter, broken sound that sent a chill down my spine. You think this is over, he said, his voice dripping with menace. You think you're safe just because you've got a few lawyers on your side? I'll make sure you pay for this, Alex. One way or another. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't understand who you're dealing with. I've got connections, people who owe me favors. People who can make your life a living hell. I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar anger rise within me. Do whatever you want, Brad. But know this, you lost. Caitlin, your reputation, your business, it's all slipping through your fingers, and there's nothing you can do about it. His face contorted in rage, and he took a menacing step toward me, but I stood my ground, my fists clenched, ready for whatever he might throw. But before he could do anything, the sound of sirens cut through the silence, flashing red and blue lights flooding the room. Brad whipped around, looking out the window, his face twisting with panic. He turned back to me, his eyes wide with realization. You called the cops, he spat, barely able to contain his fury. I smiled, my voice calm and steady. Consider it a safety measure. The police officers burst in, separating us, forcing Brad back as he cursed and shouted. They dragged him outside, cuffing his hands behind his back as he struggled, his voice growing more desperate, more broken with every passing second. "This isn't over, Alex," he screamed as they shoved him into the back of the squad car. "I'll make you pay, I swear it." I watched as they drove off, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The chaos had finally passed, and I could breathe again. But I knew this wasn't the end. Brad's threats echoed in my mind, a dark reminder of the danger that still lingered. I had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it go. As the car disappeared down the street, I turned back toward my house, my mind racing with what had just happened. I'd won the first battle, but Brad wasn't the type to accept defeat. I could still feel the weight of his words, the promise of revenge hanging in the air. But for the first time, I felt ready to face it. A few days passed without any sign of Brad. The police had warned him to stay away from me, and while I knew a man like him wouldn't back down easily, the silence was a welcome relief. But just as I started to feel like I could finally breathe, Caitlin showed up. It was late afternoon, and I was in my office sorting through the divorce paperwork, mentally preparing for the clean break I was working so hard to achieve. The knock at the door was soft, hesitant, a stark contrast to Brad's aggressive outburst. I opened it to find Caitlin standing there, looking disheveled, her eyes rimmed red and her expression worn. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to slam the door in her face, to tell her to get lost, but something in her eyes stopped me. Part of me still wanted answers, to understand why she'd thrown everything away. Reluctantly, I stepped aside, letting her into the living room where she once felt so at home. She sat down on the edge of the couch, avoiding my gaze, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. It was strange, seeing her like this, small, almost fragile. The woman who'd taunted me, who had stood by Brad as he tore into my life, now looked like she was holding on by a thread. "What do you want, Caitlin?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging. I made a mistake," she murmured, glancing up at me. "I never should have, with Brad. It was a terrible mistake, Alex. I don't know what I was thinking." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and sharp. "You don't know what you were thinking? After everything you did, after you stood by and watched while he humiliated me, threatened me. Now you're here, looking for sympathy?" Her face crumpled, but I wasn't about to let her play the victim. "Don't forget, Caitlin, you chose him. You were so sure of it, so smug. And now that his little empire is crumbling, you're suddenly full of regret?" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I didn't know he was like this. I thought he was different." "Different? You thought he was better than me, didn't you?" I couldn't hold back the anger simmering in my voice. "You thought you could trade up, walk all over me, and get away with it. Now that things aren't so perfect with him, you're crawling back. It's pathetic." She swallowed, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. "That's not fair, Alex. You don't know what it was like. I felt trapped, bored. I just wanted to feel alive again. And Brad, he made me feel that way." I shook my head, disgusted. "So, your solution was to betray me, to throw everything we had away for a quick thrill?" She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't come here to make excuses. I thought maybe you could understand. I don't know what I was thinking, but I know I made a mistake." The desperation in her voice almost made me feel a twinge of sympathy, but I knew better. "So, what do you want from me now, Caitlin? Forgiveness? A second chance?" She looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I want to try to make things right. I know I don't deserve it, but maybe we can still salvage something." I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. After everything she'd done, after the lies, the betrayal, the utter disregard for our life together, she had the audacity to come here asking for another chance. It was almost laughable. You don't get it, do you? I said, shaking my head. There's nothing left to salvage. You and Brad tore it all apart. You stood by him as he ripped my life to pieces. And now, when it's convenient for you, you want to come back? She flinched, biting her lip, her hands clenching into fists. I know I hurt you, Alex. I know I messed up, but nothing, Caitlin. I snapped, unable to contain my anger any longer. You chose Brad over me. You didn't just cheat, you enjoyed every minute of it, flaunted it, humiliated me. And now that he's in trouble, you're here, hoping to pick up the pieces. It doesn't work that way. She sat there, stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to stand up for myself. Maybe she thought I'd be the same passive man she could manipulate. But I wasn't that man anymore. I don't want you here, Caitlin. I don't need you, and I don't owe you anything. You made your choice. Now, live with it. For a moment, I thought she might say something more, but instead, she nodded, a look of resignation settling over her face. She stood up, looking defeated, her shoulders slumped. Without another word, she turned and walked to the door. But before she left, she glanced back, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. I really am sorry, Alex, she whispered. I watched her leave, a strange sense of finality washing over me as the door closed behind her. For the first time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Caitlin was gone, out of my life, and this time, it was for good. There was no going back. As I stood there in the silence, I realized that I'd been given the closure I needed. Caitlin's apology didn't erase what she'd done, but it was a reminder that I'd survived, that I'd come out stronger, even if she hadn't. This was the beginning of something new, and I was ready to leave the past behind. After Caitlin left, an unusual calm settled over me. The weight of betrayal, the relentless anger, even the humiliation, they all felt like echoes, fading into the background. Standing there in the quiet, I realized this was finally my life to rebuild, and I felt ready to start over. But I wasn't naive. Brad's words about making me pay still echoed in the back of my mind. I kept my guard up, especially when a couple of weeks passed without a word from him. It felt too quiet, like the eye of a storm. Then, just when I thought things might settle, I got a call. It was from Detective Keller, one of the officers who had taken Brad away that night. Mr. Walker, he began, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We received a report of suspicious behavior. Brad's been asking around about you, making threats. I'd advise you to be careful and keep an eye out. Hearing that confirmed my suspicions, but it didn't shake me the way it might have weeks ago. I thanked Detective Keller, promising to be vigilant, but I knew I couldn't keep living in fear. Brad was going down, whether he liked it or not, and I would make sure of it. As luck would have it, karma was already working its magic. Brad's financial troubles had finally caught up to him. The authorities, alerted by the evidence I'd given them, were investigating his business for fraud. His reputation was ruined, his funds frozen, and soon he'd be facing criminal charges. Even his most loyal business partners had abandoned him, unwilling to be dragged down with him. Brad had thought he could threaten me and walk away unscathed, but now, it was his world collapsing around him. One evening, I found myself on a drive, wanting to take in the feeling of freedom, to clear my mind after everything that had happened. As I drove past familiar places, I realized something that surprised me: I didn't hate Caitlin anymore. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they'd become parts of my past, scars that reminded me of who I'd been and how far I'd come. And then, in a quiet moment of reflection, I thought about the things I'd learned. People who truly care about you don't just walk away when things get difficult. Real love, the kind I thought we'd had, demands respect, loyalty, and honesty. Caitlin's betrayal had taught me that, painful as it was. Months went by, and I immersed myself in things I'd forgotten I loved. Old hobbies, new friendships, work projects that had been on hold. I poured my energy into rebuilding my life from the ground up, making it into something I could truly call my own. I started seeing a therapist, too, talking through the anger and betrayal, learning to let go in ways I hadn't thought possible. With every session, every conversation, the past faded, replaced by a stronger, more resilient version of myself. One evening, as I was wrapping up at work, my phone buzzed with a message from Detective Keller. Brad had been formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, along with a slew of other financial crimes. He'd be going to prison, likely for a long time. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of true closure, knowing he wouldn't be able to reach me, let alone threaten me again. Life didn't go back to what it had been before Caitlin and Brad, but I didn't want it to. I'd come through the fire, and I was stronger for it, more determined to live life on my own terms. And somewhere along the way, I stopped looking back. If I could give advice to anyone going through betrayal, it would be this: don't let it define you. You're stronger than the pain, tougher than the lies, and, eventually, you'll find yourself again. The scars will fade, and you'll move on, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. And with that, I closed the door on that chapter of my life.